This DVD continues from Volume 1. If you haven't watched the previous volume, it's highly recommended that you do so first. Just as spatial continuity was about taking separate shots and creating the illusion of continuous and unbroken space, temporal continuity is about creating the illusion of continuous and unbroken time. Much of this happens in editing, but blocking and editing are so interwoven that one really can't function without the other. So let's look at the essentials of editing. Editing is really a harsh thing to do because nothing in our world resembles the surprise of suddenly being somewhere else, so we usually want to bring as little attention to it as possible. The edits that flow best are the ones where we have something to follow across the edit because our attention is on that instead of the edit. As the man sits down, we're following his motion and we ignore the edit. Cutting in the middle of an action is a classic way to bridge cuts, and it works with both small and large movement. We might sometimes even create arbitrary action to bridge two cameras that would otherwise be a hard cut. As soon as a character is in motion, editing becomes less visible. Here we cut wide as soon as he starts walking. At the end of the walk, we'll cut close just before he stops. But in static dialogue, we don't automatically have something to follow across the edit, and this can easily get choppy if we cut at random. Here we're cutting between the characters without any particular care, and every cut is a surprise. But if we guide the editing by our curiosity and desire to see a character's reaction, we're following the interaction and we're likely to ignore the edits. Cutting based on curiosity is very effective because as we become interested in the other character, our thoughts shift, which mentally is already an edit. This mental editing in the viewer's mind is best illustrated with a situation where the man is saying something of great importance to the woman, but we hold back on the cut to her. As he keeps talking, we're now much more interested in her, and we actually want the edit. Editing when our curiosity shifts creates very seamless edits because we already think that way. Cutting before or after the natural edit point creates the feeling that we're either ahead of or behind the action. As the man walks to the table, we cut ahead, and he catches up, which creates a feeling of eagerness or knowing something before the characters do. Starting wide again, we'll let him walk over, and cut after the action, which creates a feeling of being held back or knowing something later than the characters. Cutting from a static shot to one with action, or vice versa, has the effect of suddenly speeding up or slowing down the pacing of the scene. Here we'll first start on the man in a static shot and then cut to the woman's walk into the scene. So starting on him, we're at rest. But cutting to her, the pace suddenly scoots ahead, which makes her appear more dynamic than him. Cutting into action usually creates a jolt and can be used for that purpose, for instance, to open a new scene on a high note. Here we're starting on the woman and pan with her into the scene, but suddenly cut to a static shot on the man, which abruptly slows down the pace and makes him appear unmoving or rigid by comparison. When there's no action and nothing to follow across an edit, the cut likewise brings a lot of attention to itself, which can be used intentionally. Here the man is sitting by his desk, and as we cut wide to make him appear lonely, the cut deliberately brings attention to that. In piecing together coverage, we're trying to create the illusion that all cameras are recording the same moment, even though they're shot hours or days apart. It's naturally crucial that what we're shooting is repeatable so that when editing, the characters will have identical postures on both sides of a cut. In this camera, the man is looking straight at the woman. But in this camera, shot later, he's looking into the ground while talking, so we're clearly not recording the same moment. We can only edit when each actor looks similar on both sides of the cut, which restricts the editing to those rare moments, and this can sometimes force us to use a lesser take for continuity reasons. So it's important for actors to know how to do repeatable body movement, and we need to be extremely adamant about getting it right. But if we're working with an actor who simply doesn't have good continuity, it's crucial that we make the choice to either simply edit less or to be absolutely sure to get single shots. In this close-up, we don't know what the woman is doing, so cutting to her, any body posture within reason is believable to have happened off camera. Going back to the man, he could reasonably have tilted his head in the meanwhile. Close-ups can literally save a scene that could otherwise be uncuttable. Cutting movement, we also notice immediately if the action on either side of the cut is at different speeds, which often flies under the radar when shooting. In the first camera, the man sits down fairly fast. And in the closer camera, shot later, he sits down slowly. As we cut it together, there's a sudden change of speed and the scene appears patched together. When cutting action, we need to obey the laws of physics. At the edit point, there's nothing that stops us from skipping ahead or back in time, which produces some unusual artifacts. Here the man sits down and we cut close, but we're cutting ahead in time, so we're missing a piece of time in the logic of the scene. Here the man sits down again, but part of his action is included twice. When we don't obey the laws of physics, the edit immediately brings attention to itself. When the man takes a natural amount of time to sit down, the edit is seamless. But as long as the action is repeatable, we can be reasonably sure that simply covering it from several angles will cut fine. We only need to be sure that each camera is rolling well before and well after the part we want to use, not just to have freedom in editing, but to get the actors up to speed before they're on, and to get any extra reactions. Finally, it's important to cover movement from the same side of the action in each camera, which ensures that the characters are moving in the same direction on the screen before and after the cut. This creates the same spatial continuity as honoring the line, because our left-right relationships stay the same. As we cut, the man's screen direction is left to right in both shots. So for the record, let's put the second camera on the wrong side. The man again walks from left to right. But as we cut, he's now moving right to left, which is a little surprising. The ability to skip forward or backward in time at the edit point is what allows us to control the pacing of a scene, and is one of the most expressive aspects of editing, or one of the most frustrating if the scene isn't shot right. So in this chapter, we want to look at creating maximum freedom to adjust timing in editing. The first freedom comes from having gaps between all lines of dialogue. Looking at the audio for a dialogue covered in two over the shoulders, the red waveforms are the man's lines and the blue waveforms are the woman's lines. Assuming that the characters have perfect continuity, we'll cut exactly in the middle on both sides of the edit, resulting in roughly the same timing as before. But if we use less of the gap both before and after the edit, we're speeding up time. If we use more of the gap both before and after the edit, we're essentially playing part of the same moment twice, resulting in a stretched out pause. But this is as far as we can stretch, because we need to cut before the other character starts speaking in each take, which is often visible even with their backs turned. In close-ups, we can stretch time much more by eating into the other character's dialogue on both sides of the cut. Since the other character isn't visible, all we have to do is mask out their sound with room tone, which we can find at the beginning and end of most takes. Gaps are what give us all the control in editing, so the longer gaps the better, at least from an editing perspective. This is pretty much common knowledge, but it's the first thing that goes out the window when shooting. It's sometimes hard to get actors to make gaps, and actors also often begin to step on each other's lines to work up a momentum, which makes editing very difficult, not to mention sound mixing. Interruptions are extremely hard to get rid of, but very easy to create after the fact. So if the scene needs one, it's better to get it clean and created in editing, which is where timing is really first created. The second freedom comes from cutaways. Anytime we cut between completely separate shots, we lose any time reference, and we can cut ahead or back in time on the next edit. This becomes important as we look at character movement, which we almost always want to cut shorter or longer. Here the man walks over to the woman. He walks. And walks. And since we're covering this in just one camera, we have no choice but to include the entire movement, which ultimately gets dull. So in order to shorten the movement, we'll place a cutaway on the woman. This gives us a reason to cut, which is essential if we want to change the timing. So starting on the man again, he walks. And we cut to the woman. When we cut back to him, we can simply cut ahead in time and make him arrive when we want to, unless we break the laws of physics by having him travel too far, too fast. In cheating timing for long walks, it's useful to notice that it's much harder to make out a character's position seen from the front than it is from the side. Doing the same thing from the side, the man's travel is much more visible. So as we cut away to the woman and back on the man, there's no way the man could have traveled this distance in this time. The key to stretching time is usually to simply get more angles of the same thing and therefore have more reasons to cut. Here the man has a fairly short walk, but we'll cover it in an exaggerated concoction of multiple angles, POVs, and cutaways. So starting in a wide shot, we'll cut to a close-up. Then a POV. Then an insert on his feet. A cutaway on the woman. Back in another close-up, all the time playing the same moment over and over again, ending in this shot. A third freedom to change the timing of movement comes from avoiding visual references. The first way to do that is to frame cameras so we can't see the area being traveled. Here the man walks from this desk to this desk, so we'll place two cameras both shooting from the side. As he walks out of the first shot, he quickly clears the frame. The second shot is also from the side, so he steps in at the last minute. Without covering the movement, we have no way of knowing the distance between the two shots, so we're free to make up the timing in editing. We can of course create a cutaway to put in the middle if we need a long walk and we don't want to be parked on an empty frame. Starting in the first camera, he clears the frame. We go to the cutaway on the woman, stay here for as long as we want him to travel, then cut to the ending shot as he steps in. The second way to avoid visual references is to use a close-up of the action that's in open enough framing that we lose orientation. Here the man has a fairly long walk, which we'll cover by panning with him in a tight shot and end with having him step into a wider shot. Since we're covering him in a fairly narrow shot, we have no way of knowing exactly where he is. So we can again make him arrive when we want to by cutting to the ending of his next shot. We only perceive time on a very local level, and we only pick up errors in immediate continuity. But we can easily accept cutting out several days of the story if nothing interesting happens, because that's how we think. If the man walks from a scene in a forest to a scene in an office several days later in the story, we mentally simply bridge the gap. Cutting out long stretches of time is usually more an issue of writing than directing. But within the scene, we of course have the classic methods to compact time, like doing a montage. As we fade between a series of situations in the same location, we understand the intent and perceive time passing rapidly. And again, cutaways can be used to remove much longer stretches of time. Here the characters are waiting for an important phone call. We'll cut to a clock, which is maybe a little on the nose. But when we cut back, the fact that the characters are arranged differently tells us that time has passed. Finally, speed changes can very effectively change our perception of time. Shooting at a lower frame rate, the resulting motion is higher speed, which has very few uses, one of which is to speed up certain moments in action sequences. But shooting much slower, the result is time-lapse photography, which depicts a substantial passing of time quickly. Shooting at a higher frame rate, resulting in slow motion, is a powerful way to stretch out a moment that would have happened too fast in real time. Here the woman realizes that her neighbor is the murderer, which is a significant moment, so shooting at normal speed doesn't really convey the gravity. Shooting at high speed, we stretch out this crucial moment, which is extremely effective. As we begin to work with covering moving characters, let's first look at how to get the maximum mileage out of each single camera. The classic Hollywood way to cover scenes was to do very long takes with almost no editing and have the characters arrange themselves in front of the camera in a sort of theater on film. Creating the framing entirely by how we place the characters is the opposite of how most of us have learned to go about staging, but it's really the most essential method. So assuming for a moment that we only have one camera and we can't edit, we need to put the entire blocking effort into how we arrange the characters. Here the characters need to stop, but instead of having them stop randomly, we'll have them end in a deliberate framing. As the dialogue continues, we'll have the man walk over here. We'll then have the woman approach him, creating a symmetrical framing right in front of the camera. As a third character joins them and ends up exactly between them deeper into the frame, we've gotten an enormous amount of mileage out of this single shot. And we seem to always happen upon good framings by chance, which gives a sense of purpose to the blocking. But the great thing about this is the ability to transform the camera from one shot type to another. Looking again at the first shot, a right-angle master becomes an over-the-shoulder, which is even clearer as he turns. He leaves. The woman walks closer, and we're now a close-up single shot. He walks back in, and we're now a flipped over the shoulder. Even if we don't intend to do long takes like this, transforming a camera to a different shot type lets us use a camera for more than one thing, which is both economical and elegant. So in picking coverage for moving characters, the first thing to look for is ways to have cameras serve double function, and for that let's build a small repertoire of moves that can be used in most scenes. The first is a single shot becoming an over-the-shoulder. Starting in a single shot on the woman, this is her shot for the first half of the scene. But when the man steps in, the shot is now an over-the-shoulder. The man is really just stepping into an over-the-shoulder, but since we didn't expect the camera to also function as that, it seems like a lucky coincidence that the framing works. It also creates the feeling of having more cameras than we really do. As the man steps in, it's clear that the camera is simply changing shape. But when we edit a scene with 5 such cameras together, they suddenly feel like 10, which theoretically cuts the shooting day in half, but is also easier to deal with. The key to doing this is to know where we're going. Here we've been cutting dialogue between 2 single shots. As the red woman talks, we cut to the blue woman. As the red woman now steps forwards, we've deliberately framed the blue woman's single shot so it can become an over-the-shoulder here, and the shot transforms very elegantly. Building an over-the-shoulder with a rear character is just as effective. Here we're in single shots on both the man and the woman. Starting on the woman, we cut a bit of dialogue between them. So having clearly established that we're seeing 2 single shots, the woman walks over into his shot, he turns, and we're now an over-the-shoulder. And to cover the dialogue, all we have to do is add a matching reverse here. Going from an over-the-shoulder back into a single shot doesn't produce the same transforming feeling because we've already seen the completed frame. But having her morph the shot into a close-up as he leaves, we've now gotten 3 distinct shot types out of a single camera, which makes the scene feel a lot more complex than it would have otherwise. Let's quickly go over some other transformations that are useful to have handy. The next one is reusing a camera while replacing a character. Here the man walks out, and we're now a single shot. After a while, the blue woman walks in where he stood before, transforming the shot back into an over-the-shoulder. Another move is turning an over-the-shoulder into another over-the-shoulder. So starting in one, the man walks to the other side of the woman, and we've essentially flipped it. Also, a relevant move is having a character isolate herself by moving close to the camera, which we'll cover in more detail later. Additionally, 2 particular framings are useful to arrive in as a result of movement, an over-the-shoulder and a right-angle master. Here the characters are walking through an office and will at some point stop for dialogue. So we'll have them stop in an over-the-shoulder in front of the camera. We could, of course, arrive in any framing, but a framing like this is more deliberate and can immediately become an integral part of the blocking if we add a reverse. After the man walks out, and the blue woman steps in creating an over-the-shoulder, let's do the same with the right-angle master. As they talk, we'll have them meet in a symmetrical shot here. Again, we could arrive in any kind of framing, but by arriving in mindful framings, the blocking feels more on track. As we do this with more characters, the key is to set up shots for when they contain the most characters, and then have the characters gradually build that frame by walking to their marks. Here the man is standing opposite the woman for the first half of the scene, then walks closer for dialogue with the red woman. So let's set up a 3-shot for the ending first. We'll arrange it as a right-angle master with a blue woman in the background. If we now move the man back to 1, this will be our shot on the women for the first part of the dialogue. And this will be our shot on the man. So cutting back and forth, it seems like normal dialogue. But when he walks over, we happen upon an excellent framing here. This works no matter how complex the framing is. Here we're covering 3 characters in separate shots for the first half of the scene, but they will ultimately join each other towards the middle. So let's set up a shot for that first and have the characters end in this framing. With these positions memorized, we'll now use this shot as the red man's single shot long before the ending. For cutting the initial dialogue, we're going back and forth between the red man's shot, the red woman's single shot, and the blue woman's shot, which is overlapping for spatial continuity. As the red woman walks over, she steps into a wide over the shoulder. As the blue woman walks over, she steps in front of the same shot, which has now visibly changed shape twice. Covering character movement is really about covering all the places the characters stop. This is extremely easy to do and adequately covers the vast majority of scenes. Let's start with a simple situation where the woman walks over to the man. She has a short dialogue with him, then walks out, but stops on her way out, turns for another dialogue, and finally leaves completely. It's usually easiest to start with the most central character positions and then work our way forwards and backwards in time, so let's place 2 reverses in a right-angle master for this dialogue. Before that, this camera works as a single shot on the man, and this camera can cover her initial walk. But let's also put in a camera for where she starts. When she walks out and stops, we've aimed her walk so this camera can function as an over-the-shoulder for this position. Let's put in a camera for before she turns, which will give us a personal view with her in front. After she turns, this camera can function as an over-the-shoulder, but let's also get 2 close-ups, one on her and one on the man. So that took about 10 seconds to plan. We're starting on the woman. The man says something to her. She walks over, and we cover the rest of her walk in this over-the-shoulder. His single shot is now an over-the-shoulder, and we can edit this part of the scene to taste using the 2 reverses in the right-angle master. We're in this over-the-shoulder as she walks out. The man thinks for a bit, then says something to her, causing her to stop. We cut to this over-the-shoulder for the second dialogue, which right now has her in front, and the close-up on the man. Back on her, she turns, and the shot becomes a reel over the shoulder. Here we have 2 close-ups and 2 over-the-shoulders to cut the dialogue from. We're in this over-the-shoulder as she leaves. Then cut to the man's close-up, where he stands for a bit, then walks out. That's really all there is to it. The only other thing to be aware of is having enough cameras running at any given time to have cutting options. In the beginning, the crossed-out cameras wouldn't be shooting anything useful. As soon as the woman walks, we can already cut the first camera. And for the next dialogue, we're editing between the 2 reverses and the master. As soon as she walks out, the master in the other reverse cease being useful, and the other cameras aren't useful until she stops again, so we depend on the current camera working. For the last dialogue, all 4 cameras set up for that are good. As she walks out, her close-up is quickly empty, but we'll leave the remaining 3 cameras running, especially the close-up on the man, which we planned on ending in. A thing that works well is to frame all stops for when they have the most characters in them, and then allow the characters to gradually build the framing for each stop. In this scene, the man and the woman are having some difficulties in their relationship, and the woman is trying to avoid him. So the rough plan is that she'll walk over here. He will follow, and not getting her attention, he'll walk over behind her. She'll then walk away again, and he'll again follow. The reason we're not being more particular is that we want to stage the scene as 2 or 3 framings that the characters will then move between, so right now we're only interested in the times the framings are complete. At some point in the beginning, both characters will be here, and we'll frame a shot for that. At a later point, both characters will be here, and we'll frame a shot for that. Later again, both characters are here, which we'll place a camera for here. For a last stop, let's go back to the first framing and reuse the first camera. But since the characters aren't moving at the same time, we get the effect of them building the framings. The first shot is complete. But as the woman walks away, she has the next shot to herself, although it's framed for 2 characters. The man also has an incomplete shot, although it's framed for 2. As he walks over to the woman, he steps into her shot and completes the framing. The third camera is right now a single shot on the woman, with space for the man to step into. So as the man steps out of the previous shot and into this one, he completes the framing. She walks back to the first shot, so this is now a single shot on him. And the first shot is a single shot on her, until he walks over and completes the framing. As long as we're not creating any line issues, simply covering the stops and allowing characters to move between them is all it takes. So let's move on to look at why exactly characters move. Unless we're doing completely improvised filmmaking, we're the ones deciding on character movement and not the actors. Some of us aren't comfortable having to decide every minute character movement, and some actors also feel restricted by meticulous blocking. But from an audience perspective, well-planned blocking is far more impactful than spontaneous movement, which often produces very random and unexpressive shots. So we naturally need to plan movement that emphasizes the psychology of the scene. One place to get ideas is by watching the rehearsals and notice when the actors feel like moving. But what we want to do in this chapter is build a list of motivations that we can use to write blocking that makes sense without any input. Characters move for the same reasons that people do, and the vast majority of movement falls into these categories: initiative, control or territory, discomfort, becoming more personal, and becoming more private. Initiative is anything a character does with a sense of purpose. First of all, characters usually have very literal things to do in a scene, which are often written in the script. Here the script says that the woman grooms a plant and then walks over to the phone while talking to the man.